Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
Today's episode is a bit meta, in which we do some introspection on the field of Christian apologetics. I'm basically asking the question, what is the nature, features, use of the concept of, or the state of Christian apologetics in the second quarter of the 21st century? So here we are in 2025. We're looking back on a field of study and intrigue that I think really blossomed and developed over the last 25 years into full-bore academic studies. It's a category that Cameron and I have both spent a lot of time working in and actually educationally trained in and have a lot of thoughts about, and we'll see where it goes from here. But I think this is to get the wheels turning in your mind as you listen to this, to be asking yourself the question about the value of Christian engagement with big ideas and with culture, and where is the format, what's the avenue where this is really most meaningfully taking place. So, I mean, all simple questions. So, Cameron, if you can get us sorted out on that would be great. But as you and I can give you some examples of why I'm starting to ask these questions, or we've always wrestled with them. But what do you see? How would you define, if you had to say, here's the kind of the state of the field of Christian apologetics in 2025, and go?
Yeah, I mean, there are ways to break this down that I think might give us some clarity as well. So if you understand apologetics biblically, you'll see that it heavily relies on discipleship. So the hallmark apologetics verse in 1 Peter 3:15 through 16 begins with set apart Christ as Lord in your heart. So before before the always being ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give
even
a defense
before
for the
you
hope
get
that
a
is within you,
PhD.
even before you get a PhD. So the shape of Christian apologetics, if we want to call it that might be a little bit of a anachronism honestly. But yeah, I mean, in the early church, I mean, the word there is apologia, but the way it would have looked is you were prepared to answer why you look different from everybody else in the surrounding Roman Empire. So you stood out.
And to give some specifics there is that if you look at the early apologias or the early defenses, you have the apologist saying, look at what good lives these people are living. Why would you persecute them? And so it wasn't really it wasn't an intellectual, philosophical, game of chess. It was kind of like, look at the lifestyle produced. These people are living with hope in difficult situations, and they're good for the society, the country, the culture around them. Therefore, give them a break. So that it was really embedded you'll know a tree by its fruit kind of articulation and analysis.
Yeah, and one of the first, I think, real full-blown apologetics works would probably be Justin Martyr's The Apology, right? So that's apologetics in its real early instantiation. That's what it looks like scripturally, and that remains true to this day. I think Nathan and I will both hold the line on that one, and that's something that both Nathan and I think, try to bring in whenever we talk about it. But there's a good chance that if you hear the word apologetics and you are familiar with it, many people aren't. Most people aren't, as a matter of fact, still. But if you are, that maybe is not where your mind went right away.
Right.
Because as Nathan mentioned earlier, apologetics has kind of grown in recent years, and it's become a full-fledged academic field in the sense that you can not only can you pursue a master's degree in apologetics now, you can actually do a PhD in apologetics. There are many seasoned apologists out there. And what this version of apologetics is devoted to, I think really the best definition on the market right now would still be the art and science of Christian persuasion. It's really all about, so speaking to people who are not Christians, whether they're skeptics or whether they belong to a different faith tradition, or perhaps Christians who are struggling with serious doubts. It's speaking to people in various degrees of, holding various degrees of skepticism toward Christianity and providing logical, coherent, rational arguments for the faith.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I would,
So
yeah. Well, we'll
well,
pause there
I'm
for a
just
second.
well. Yeah. That's helpful. But if you think about the idea of the art of Christian persuasion, and you look at this in a historical lens, that wasn't. I'm trying to think historically where you see good examples of this, because by and large, it was like, okay, intra faith conversations. You can go back to Calvin, Luther, Zwingli, like arguing about the presence,
Mm,
in the
right.
Eucharist. Like you have a lot of theological church history is about the Church of England being formed because King Henry's arguing with the Pope. Like it's a lot of internal conflict. And that the spread of Christianity had a lot more to do with like territorial disputes and princes and armies, and then you had religious wars. And so it wasn't really like you were trying to persuade somebody through rational debate and dialogue. It was like, hey, we're coming to take your sheep. Like, you know what I mean? It wasn't this. Now, that's not to say that it didn't happen. I was really, Timothy it's back in the 700s. He was a bishop. His name was Timothy, who had some really neat dialogues with some Muslim leaders about the
Mm-hmm.
nature of God and Trinitarian thought. And so it was happening a little bit, but by and large, I don't think most people were asking. I think people had a more rigidly defined concept of what it meant to be a Christian that was much more cultural and genetic and um help me out here. I'm trying to make it
Well,
figure
some
out
of
a
the
distinction of why did apologetics as an art of persuasion for those outside of the faith become a thing that was A, separated from evangelism, and B, separated from
mhm.
just conquest.
Well, because first of all, a key word here is going to be defense. So apologetics does involve defense. So, but you're looking at defense in a pagan context when you look at the scriptural examples. And so you do have some pictures in scripture of real moments of an orator like Paul at the Areopagus, for instance, giving a very powerful apologetic speech. Now that what he's doing at the Areopagus looks a little bit more like cultural apologetics, but we get there in a second. But you do have some of those moments in scripture, but what changed though, and where some critiques of apologetics from Christians come into play, and I think some of them with some legitimacy, what changes is now when you move into an overwhelmingly secular kind of academic environment. I always want to stress that because most people around the globe believe in some kind of a higher power or are religious still in nature. The overwhelming majority
Mhm.
of the globe is not secular. But we have come to a cultural juncture as the modern world progresses that where many of our elite institutions are secular, right? So in that context, the shape of apologetics begins to shift, and there are concerted efforts to defend Christianity on the basis of rationality. In other words,
Mhm.
we want to show that Christianity is a reasonable faith. Now, think about how often you hear the word rational or reasonable. I mean, there are reasonable faith. That's actually a ministry out there. Those become watchwords, and it's understandable, and there are some laudable features there. One of the critiques of that, though, is that if you go too far, if you try to meet your critics on their own terms, sometimes the terms are the wrong terms. And so if you get to a place where you so prioritize human reason, you elevate it so high, you basically are making the same mistake that Enlightenment philosophers made, where they kind of idolized reason. Now, I'm not accusing all apologists of doing this. I'm saying apologetics, modern or contemporary apologetics, can go astray in this direction sometimes when reason is, with the best of intentions, elevated so highly that it basically becomes idol. You kind of idolize reason, and then of course human reason is not infallible, and it's it's not perfect.
That's
And so some
reasonable
of
to
those,
conclude. Yeah.
right, and so some of the more searing and serious critiques that come in from deconstructionism or some features of postmodernism. So one way are more potent. I mean, one way to, I've heard it put this way before, and I think it's helpful. you don't have to buy into all the conclusions of postmodern philosophy and deconstructionism, but you can accept part of what you can accept is a level of intellectual humility. And that can be, in other words, human beings, we do have a finite and contingent perspective. Now, I think that some of these philosophers carry that too far. It's a false dilemma to say, well, because we're contingent, we're finite, we have a limited perspective, we're to a certain extent historically conditioned. It's one thing to say to note those as features of human life. That's true. It's another thing to say those make any kind of major judgments impossible, or you can't really know anything for certain. There's no way we have true access to truth. That I don't think that follows.
Okay,
but I do think we can argue for epistemic humility.
Is this changing? So, let's go back 1960s. The God is Dead, Time magazine, kind of famous idea. Is that the kickstart? Because I would say, okay, Paul is at the Areopagus and he's talking about an idol or a monument to an unknown. So it's a theistic framework that he's operating in. I mean, if you set up an idol to an unknown God, you think that there's a divine spectrum, at least, or range that's happening out there. You get to like 1960, the God is Dead idea. And then you have this backlash, I think. Does that kind of kick into overdrive the Christian apologetic movement as an academic principle? The analytic Christian philosophers come to bat there. And so you say, okay, it felt to me like when I was doing a lot of time in New England that, okay, so you have to define and defend the idea of the concept of the possibility or the plausibility of there being a God. Then you have to define and defend the possibility of the concept of the idea of there actually being any truth. Then you have to define and defend the concept of the possibility of the fact that you can know the truth and that can be, written down in something like scriptures. And then like you're 3 hours in to having to justify all the criteria in order before you can talk about something out of the book of John.
Yeah. So you're permanently on the back foot. And another weakness of weakness, I don't know, necessary limitation of, say, a more analytical or narrow approach to Christian defenses would be that some of those theistic arguments are not very specific. They could apply if you're a Muslim, you could use those as well. They certainly don't bring you,
for example.
Correct. Yeah. They don't bring you to, so can they be a stepping stone? Yeah, actually they can, but do they bring you to Father, Son, Holy Spirit? No. So that's a serious limitation. But yeah, but I think what people became more aware of and have wised up to is that you don't have to be in a position of being permanently defensive. Now you can be if you allow yourself to be. I've got to defend the veracity of Scripture. Yes, I've got to defend the divinity of Christ. Okay, now Christ. I've got to defend give historical evidence for the resurrection. So those kinds of pursuits, by the way, those are perennial. I think there are times where they're going to be more needed than others, or where they're going to be more important or more culturally relevant than others. We call those evidential arguments. They're always needed, but sometimes they're more important than others. I think we're kind of in an era right now where they have taken a little bit of a backseat. We can come back to that in a second. But my point is, some people eventually recognized, no. We have a different starting point. That makes sense. Christianity is a different worldview. But we also, because we are Christians, believe on our views, the fact that our universe is knowable, that reason works in the first place, the faculty of reason, that it works, that it's reliable, that the institution of science works, that the universe can be known in terms of laws of cause and effect, that it makes sense. None of that is self-evident. And in fact, if we follow naturalism, all of those become very problematic because we don't have intrinsic meaning at all. So why is it the case that the universe is in fact legible? Why does it seem to be the case that reason works, that science works, that we can in fact trust our minds, that we do have access to truth? Why should that be? On Christianity, this all makes sense. On naturalism, it becomes more problematic. So I think a lot of
And there you get
Christians
Alvin
begin
Plantinga's book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, that's poking
Yes.
at this apparent contradiction between science and naturalism, not between science and faith. So I think that's a classic example of a big old book where you have an analytic philosopher being like, well, bam, let's call a spade here. Here's where the problem really is.
Yep.
And that's helpful.
That's a devastating book for, I think a lot of people by wide consensus many non-Christians have said, yes, it's such a robust argument. So hugely helpful. But
okay.
But yeah, so I think that was apologetics. Yeah. Bit, maybe an era ago. Yes.
All right. So let's be clear, like the way that our minds are hardwired and the ways that we've studied, like we were built for Christian apologetics. However, so this is like, I'm not denigrating the field at all. We play in the pool, man.
Yeah.
But I can honestly say that when it wasn't until after I was in college. So we're talking like 2010 plus. Probably around, like, I don't think I knew anybody who had heard the word Christian apologetics until I was 22 years old. Like it was an entire, and that's not to say that there weren't people who were like, hey, why do we believe this thing is true about the Bible? It's not that there weren't people asking big questions and that there was a philosophical justification or rationality behind stuff. It's just that it wasn't even on my radar as a thing that people did as a profession. And I knew a lot of really talented and people that articulating their Christian faith and deep Christian communities who had no clue that it even existed as a thing. It was just part of something bigger, and it wasn't its own little niche academic field.
Yep.
So I say that to say that there's great value to the field of Christian apologetics, and there's a sense in which it's totally not necessary in the modern, academically defined sense of it. And that hurts me to say because I like it, but that comes back to the humility part there. Yeah.
Well,
please.
yeah, let me amplify that a little bit, because so one of the things I try to say when I'm giving a talk on apologetics is this. I try to say, look, thank God for people who are in the guild of academia. So I try to say that while apologetics includes the academic field of apologetics, Christian apologetics is not limited to it. So it includes that. And that is very helpful. I'm really grateful for Alvin Plantinga. That man has done so much for the credibility of the Christian faith in circles where it would formally just meet with a sneer. He got it. This man almost single-handedly got it taken seriously in philosophy of religion departments. That is a major feat. And the Lord was clearly with him as he did that. So we're grateful for that. Now, sometimes when you go to apologetics conferences or presentations, you can get really excited if you're a nerd, or you might sit there and feel really overwhelmed and feel really bad about yourself and think, I'm not Alvin Plantinga. I'm not even close. I can't read all these books. Because I've heard the talks, Nathan, where, well, you better be up to speed on this latest cultural issue and trend, and you better be able to dissect
this
it.
Biblical manuscript fragment. You need to have an opinion on it.
You better have an opinion, be able to provide all this information. So let me emphatically say, no, you don't. I am really grateful again for people who are professionals in that sense, who are academics, who can do that, produce monographs, can go on the Joe Rogan podcast and talk about this stuff with high levels of articulacy. We need them. I'm grateful, but you don't have to do that. The command for you is not to be Alvin Plantinga or to go, to do a PhD. The command is to be prepared to give an account for the hope that is within you. You have to be able to speak out of the overflow of your relationship with Christ. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be the most articulate person in the world. And there are different ways to do that, by the way, too. Some people communicate their relationship and the love of Christ through acts of hospitality, through taking care of people. See, these are forms. Maybe I'm remiss in saying that, but I think these are also ways of showing forth the credibility of the gospel by loving your neighbor. But
I mean, so let's just look at the things that Jesus actually commanded. Loving your neighbor is one, uh,
Yep.
clear biblical mandate to practice hospitality. There is no biblical mandate to get an advanced degree in Christian philosophy in order to be a faithful Christian. Now, worshiping
And
the Lord with
actually,
your mind, sure, but
and one of just to put a flag in that, one of the strongest statements from Paul in Philippians is basically he says, "Hey, you want to talk about credentials? I have all the credentials. I trained under
collected
Gamaliel.
them all.
I went to the Harvard Law School of Pharisee school, right? And I count them, but we won't say the word that he actually uses. Your translation will probably translate it as rubbish or trash or garbage. But basically, yeah. So now, is Paul denigrating academic pursuits and study? No. I mean, this is the man who, please send my parchments along with me. This Paul was a nerd. He loved to read, he loved to study, but he recognized also that in the end, if he was trying to coast along on the laurels of his earthly achievements, he was in the wrong place. The motivations are to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then love your neighbor as yourself. So those are the central commands, and that's how you establish, by the way, the credibility of the gospel. This ups the ante too, because Jesus also says they will know you are my disciples by your excellent arguments, by your bumper stickers, by the way you attack other stupid apologists who didn't get it right. No, by the love you have for one another. See, that's a huge convicting word to all of us, especially within the Christian community, and within apologetic circles, because it can often kind of devolve into petty little squabbles and debates and arguments among Christians. I'm not saying necessarily that Christians can't enter into discussions. I do, for one. This is a whole separate. We should do a podcast on this. I do question the value of most formal debates. I'm not prepared to say all, but I do question the value of most formal debates. I just do.
I say we have a debate about it.
Let's have a debate about it. But when Christian discussions devolve into attacking somebody because of some position that they hold, and then with a spirit that's clearly not kind or gracious, there's nothing very loving about it. It paints a very jaded picture for those outside the church.
Okay. So that's very helpful, because let me riff on that and take this in the direction that I wanted to. I'm hijacking it. I wonder if some of your hesitation about formal debates is not exactly what the internet is now serving up to us. And this is why. So, I think it's wonderful to live in an information age, and if you want to go watch a video on the minimal case facts for the resurrection, it's out there. There's so much evidentialistic, classical, apologetic stuff online, so many materials, so many books, so many YouTube videos, so many lectures, so many free courses. Information, to me, Cameron, doesn't seem to be the limiting factor here. But I was the other day, I'm listening to Sean McDowell interview William Lane Craig in response to Alex O'Connor's critique of Wes Huff's statements on the Joe Rogan podcast. I don't know how many people
You following me so far?
Yeah, everybody can stick along. And there's value in that. And it's helpful. But that doesn't seem to me to be where deep life transformation is happening. And if we're thinking about Christianity as a way of life, we need those questions answered. But to me, the more pressing questions culturally are not, did we get the dating of the book of Mark right plus or minus 3 years? And like Q source theory and the mathematical models of the propagation of the speed of Christianity in the 3rd century. Like tons of fun stuff to look at there. But I think the question more often is somebody walking into church thinking, life looks pretty bleak. What is the best way to live? Is forgiveness possible? This is where I'm speaking as somebody who I drank and drink deeply from the well springs of the modern philosophical Christian movement, and I like it. But I also am part of a local church and recognize that the dealing with cancer is different. Like, I'm just saying, like, the apologetic field has been narrowed down into a set of questions that are not necessarily in the top 100 questions that I see people wrestling with. So they're necessary, but they're insufficient, I think, for the depth of, and to be fair, most apologists would freely admit to this, I think.
Mhm. Sure.
So I'm just wondering, when I talk about the state of apologetics in the second quarter of the 21st century, we're living in a time that is really spiritually hungry. And a lot of people are trying to figure out what's true, how do I organize my life, what's the meaning and the purpose of this, and how do I invest what I have well and make sense of it all. That there, yeah.
Yes.
So it seems like, I mean, so I've long said that if you are giving answers to questions that nobody is asking, it's a swing and a miss. Like, it doesn't do anybody any good.
Yep.
Um,
Even if you say that you ought to be asking this question. Well, I've heard some people turn around and then try to reframe it. Well, they should be asking this. Yes. But before they get there, what are they actually asking? And so I can hear our listeners, oh, you guys are so smart. What are they actually asking? Well, we don't think we're that smart, but I do think
I used to publish
based
a
on-
list of the top 35 questions you should be able to answer yearly based on what college students were
Yes.
asking.
But I think if you boiled it all down right now, and based on what Nathan's said here as well, I think the biggest question of our moment is how do I live well? Now you can break it into different ways. I mean, what does it mean to be human? But these are all various iterations of really what is the good life. It's an ancient question, but I've heard people say, well, we've moved away from evidential questions to existential questions. That's true so far as it goes, but what it really means is people want to understand how to live.
Mm-hmm.
I
Now,
think
there are standard avenues into that conversation. So I used to jokingly say, use the S questions. So sex, science, suffering, suicide, and significance. If you have
There you
something
go.
meaningful to say in response to those categories, like, it's a pretty good. But so here's where I think, like, so the Wes Huff thing with Joe Rogan, there are a couple times he made me wince. I'm like, oh, he's going to pay for that later. Some statements about the Isaiah scrolls, some things about, like, the number of witnesses there. I mean, you got to give him some credit. And he does go back and does a critique of himself and say, here's where I messed up and here's stuff that can be clarified. So I think that's good. But the proud moment comes at the end of that conversation where he's talking about ancient manuscripts and then turns a question and says, hey, Joe, what do you think about Jesus?
Yeah.
That's not an academic question, right? And so
No,
I think that was a good, like,
good
that's
pivot.
the way that should be done. Yeah, good. I mean, he did it more subtly and better than what I just described.
Oh, sure, yeah.
But like, that's what has to happen there. So I'm stuck with an admiration, a respect, and an appreciation for a field of Christian study that I'm uneasy acting like it's the end all be all of everything, and also calling for the apologist of the world to be thinking through, are we really answering the questions that people are asking? And I don't know where to find those other than churches where people are showing up. And hey, I still do college campus stuff, but rarely is the topic, like, the best questions happen after the public Q&A and somebody comes up with a one-on-one heartfelt, here's the situation I'm dealing with.
Well, of course, because a Q&A is inherently, anything public facing like that is going to have some performative elements in it necessarily. A person will feel pressure because it's just, if it's personal and one-on-one, then they can tell you what's really eating at them. And that's always the case. Even though we like to, have all sorts of, public facing stuff, and this is going to be recorded, and you can text in your question or whatever. Yeah, no. There's really going to be no replacement for just talking to somebody.
Yeah.
Even if they can, under the anonymity of a text. I mean, it's going to be better just to speak with someone. That's not really where you're going, but I just interjecting that.
No, that is part of the personal touch and element of this. So, okay, here's the thought that I've long said, is that I think some of the best apologists of our time don't identify themselves as apologists. They're really theologically informed Christian preachers and teachers. I think a lot of the best evangelists that I know are not professional evangelists and don't even know they're good evangelists. They're just the kind of people that seemingly weird situations land in their lap where they have an opportunity to give a reason for why they're still excited about life.
So here's my soundbite for that. The biblical picture is that this is an identity, not a profession.
There you go.
So now that doesn't mean, I'm not trying to argue Nathan and I into obsolescence here, but the truth is, yeah. So there are some of us who are on the nerdier side and do some of this on a frontline basis, but the true biblical picture is not that. It's that just out of the, you become a disciple of Jesus, and from the overflow of your relationship with him, that's where you see defense when it's needed and evangelism when it's called for. And sometimes they work seamlessly together. Sometimes you need one and not the other. It depends on the person. Sometimes you're speaking sort of more as an apologist with a Christian struggling with doubts, or sometimes it's a non-believer. Sometimes, the moment is just right. It's just time for you to ask, what do you think about Jesus? So
let me tell a story here. I have two stories as we go forward here, and maybe start to bring this toward a close that illustrate this for me. This was years ago. I was speaking at this student group at Harvard, and there was a young lady. I tell this story frequently because it's a good illustration of this point. There's a young lady sitting in the front row with her arms like folded and crossed. Like, I'm not an expert on body language, but like I can pick up the not so subtle hint there, right? And then there's public Q&A. She asked a couple kind of testy questions, and I was able to respond to them. I knew like kind of just general framework and ways to kind of help, think through it this way, or maybe this is, and so it was respectful dialogue. Then there's the private Q&A. So she's standing in line. I see her, I'm answering questions. She's getting closer. You're kind of looking back through the line sometimes, like, okay, which ones are going to be, spicy? And she gets up to me and she says, okay, let's cut the crap. Like, that's how the conversation starts. She's like, I don't really care about any of the questions that I asked you in Q&A. She's like, that doesn't really have anything to do with it. I'm like, oh, okay. So what are you doing here? And she said, I love this story. She said, there are 3 young women on this campus who I think have their act together and have a certain degree of confidence, who are kind and upstanding and great people that I look up to and admire. And she said, I just found out this week that all 3 of them are Christians. So I came to your talk tonight to hear what it is that Christians believe. Now, you could say, okay, neat. You go and you defend the faith in public. Blah, 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 you stand up and give the rational arguments in defense. And I don't even know what the talk was that night, or I don't remember what her questions were, or how I know that I thought they were solid responses. But the fact of the matter is that none of that really had anything to do with what God was doing in her life. And it had everything to do with 3 Christian young women who might not even known each other, or might not ever even know that they had that influence on this girl's life that made her curious in the way that they treated her. And so
notice
for me,
her question was really, how do I live? Again.
Yeah. What makes these people like that? Because I admire that.
Yeah.
And so to me, that story encapsulates the difficulty of like the 99% of what was happening there had nothing to do with me. Like, on the flip side, the 1% is here's somebody who had questions about Christianity and then saw a flyer for something of like, oh, hey, this dude's coming to talk about this thing. I wonder, and then went and asked a question. And so that story puts me in a funny knot there of saying, my role there was super insignificant. On the flip side, I was really glad that I went and did it, because it was also very important and met a need that was actually happening there. So I want to say that both of those are important, but one of those, let's keep the ratio of importance in its proper perspective there.
I like that. Well, more could be said on this topic, and more will be said on this topic in the near future for Thinking Out Loud listeners with your Thinking Out Loud bingo cards in front of you. We'll probably return to this topic, but in the meantime, yeah.
Well, let me say this before you wrap it up, is that, for years we worked for an organization that talked about evangelism and apologetics. And Thinking Out Loud has kind of styled itself in the discipleship and apologetics framework for this very reason. I mean, the entire orientation behind the work that we do is oriented around this subtle shift. So there's that part of it. And then if you look at our apologetics curriculum, it's how to think like a Christian, not how to win, these 6 arguments and 5 easy steps. It's not memorizing chess moves. It's about loving people and being able to articulate what it is that you believe to be good and what gives you hope in the world. So that's the it's funny, like we're doing it when I said that we're doing kind of a meta episode of self-reflection on who we are. It's true, because this is part of the DNA in asking these questions and trying to keep our radar tuned to what is actually needed, what's actually biblical, and then how do we stand in the gap between the two of those and make sense of the world and things that we see to be beautiful and true and good and righteous and hopeful for many people. So we love continuing to hear feedback from you guys, because those of you who are brothers and sisters in Christ who are out there living well, you're collecting kind of data and information on the questions of our time. And for those of you who are just curious about Christianity, we hope that you have a better insight in what that looks like by listening to us wrestle through these questions and ideas. And so it's our desire to serve those who are curious about Christianity and those who are curious about living well as a Christian. And we hope this is helpful to you in that. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.